Hey guys, Matt here today, getting back into John, and today we start John 10. Last time we did John 9 and did the whole thing in one video. Probably shouldn't have done the whole thing in one video, but someone had a question and the timing was just right, so did John 9 in one video. Probably didn't do a super great job, but the Lord will do what He does. So, moving on to John 10, I get into one of my favorite chapters. All of John is just so rich. It's been said that John isn't a teller, John's a shower. So John doesn't tell as much as he shows. He's painting a picture. He's got a unique writing style. And so here he records the story of Jesus talking about himself being the Good Shepherd. And two passages just jump out, scream out at me and from the Old Testament, and they are Ezekiel 34 and Psalm 118. And Psalm 118 it's just powerful. I want to talk about that today. And then we'll talk about Ezekiel 34 tomorrow. Because what Jesus is doing here is he's comparing and contrasting. He's saying, there's one good shepherd, and it's me. And all those who came before me were bad shepherds. You see, everyone was supposed to, the leaders were supposed to be good shepherds. They were supposed to be a light and draw people to Yahweh. People were supposed to see the Jews, as primarily the leaders, but all of them, and say, I want to know that God who those people belong to. Look at them. But it never was like that. You think of passages like Exodus 19 where God says, and you will be a chosen nation, a holy priesthood, a royal priesthood. And that never really happened. So then Jesus comes and he brings everyone to himself, Jew and Gentile alike. And then you see in 1 Peter 2:9, he says, for you are a chosen nation, a royal priesthood, that you should declare the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into marvelous light. And he's talking to Gentiles and Jews together, predominantly Gentiles. The big idea, the Jews never did what they were called to do. And the truth of the matter is, they couldn't. Deuteronomy 29:4, they didn't have eyes to see, ears to hear, or a heart to follow. They needed this guy. They needed the Good Shepherd. They needed the Good Shepherd to come and change their heart. So, John 10:1. We're just going to read the first 6 verses here, and we're probably going to come back because there's so much to say here. But here's what Jesus says. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in another way, that man is a thief or a robber. So there's one way to enter the sheepfold, and there's one person who does it perfectly. Verse 2, but he who enters by the door, by the appropriate way, is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. Oh, interesting. There's a gatekeeper. He opens the door for the good shepherd to come through. All right. The sheep hear his voice, the good shepherd, the one who the gatekeeper opens the door. Yeah, the sheep hear his voice, and he, the good shepherd, calls his own sheep by name. And he leads them out. Isn't that something? Verse 4, when he has brought out all his own, because not everyone belongs to the good shepherd, only those whom he calls, only those whom the gatekeeper calls, only those whom the Father calls. Right? No one comes to Jesus unless the Father draws them to him. When he, the good shepherd, brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him. Well, of course they do. He's the shepherd. For they know his voice. Interesting. A stranger they will not follow, verse 5, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. They did not understand because they didn't want to understand. They didn't have eyes to see, ears to hear, or heart to follow. Jesus says, there's a sheepfold. And there's one person that enters that sheepfold the right way. Everyone else who tries to climb over the fence, everyone else who goes another way, they're thieves and robbers. In view here are the Jewish leaders. Let's take a look. We're going to come back to this because this is screaming Ezekiel 34 where Yahweh says, you are terrible shepherds, I'm going to be the shepherd. But before we go there, let's look at Psalm 118. Psalm 118 encapsulates John 10, 1 through 6 perfectly, because there's a sheepfold and there's someone who has to go in the appropriate way. And an amazing thing, two amazing things happen when he goes in the appropriate way. Let's take a look at what happens. Psalm 118 is called an envelope. The fancy Greek word is the inclusio. And what does it mean? Well, essentially, the first verse and the last verse are the same. And what that means is they're like a bookshelf. They're like bookends, if you will, holding in a bunch of books. And the first verse goes like this: "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever." And the last verse says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever." And you say, gee, I wonder what the psalm's going to be about. Well, he already told us the whole thing is about why should we give thanks to Yahweh? Because he's good, because his steadfast love endures forever, particularly for one person who enters the door and who enters the gatekeeper, who enters the appropriate way, who enters the sheepfold the right way. He doesn't climb over, he goes through the door. And you're going to see something really cool that happens when he does that. So, Psalm 118, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever." Synonymous parallelism, and you can see it here. "Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let those who fear Yahweh say, his steadfast love endures forever." What's he doing? He's building it up, he's rounding it out, he's saying, everyone should say this, because it's true. His steadfast love endures forever for a person and for a people that are in that person. Verse 5, "Out of my distress I called on Yahweh. The Lord answered me and set me free." There's one distress. There's one calling out to the Father. And it's not David. David wrote the psalm. David was a type and a shadow. David found himself in trouble, in peril, but that was only to be a type and a shadow pointing to the one who's really crying out. Remember 1 Peter, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours, searched and inquired carefully, searching and inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was prophesying when he prophesied about the suffering and the subsequent glories. When you hear suffering, when you hear gospel, it's really the Spirit of Christ speaking through David. And why is Christ in distress? Why does everyone hate the Christ? Well, the psalmist tells us the way it starts out. There's one blessed man and one anointed king, and they're both the same. Psalm 1, Psalm 2, it's Jesus. And what do the people say in Psalm 2 to this anointed king? They say, we don't want Yahweh and we don't want his anointed king. Let us cast his cords. Let us burst their bonds. We don't want the Father and we don't want the Son. So, why is he in distress? Because everyone hates him. And also because the sins of all those who would come to the Father through him are placed on him. So he's suffering for the wrath of God that's going to come upon him because of the sins that he's going to take for the people that he's chosen, and also because everyone else hates him. No one loves the anointed king unless they're in him. So, out of my distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered and set me free. The Lord is on my side. I shall not fear. What can man do to me? Jesus isn't a man-pleaser. He comes to do the will of his Father. Verse 7, the Lord is on my side as my helper. I shall look in triumph on those who hate me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. Remember when Jesus was meeting with Pontius Pilate? Jesus could have got out of it. He could have said, yeah, I'm God and I don't need to be doing this. He could have got out of it, but he didn't do that. He didn't trust in Pilate. He didn't trust in man. He trusted in his Father. He came to do the will of his Father. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. Remember, Jesus said, I could call a legion of angels if I wanted, but I'm here to do the will of my Father. Right? Verse 10, all the nations surrounded me. Everyone hated me. Right? Even on the cross, they wagged their heads. They hate him. All the nations surrounded me. In the name of Yahweh, I cut them off. They surrounded me on every side. In the name of Yahweh, I cut them off. They surrounded me like bees. They went out like a fire among thorns. What does he do? He's in the middle of a thorn patch, surrounded by fires, bees all around him, symbolizing everyone hating him, everyone want to take him down. In the name of Yahweh, I cut them off. What does he do? He invokes the name of his father, and he cuts them off. In the name of Yahweh, I say, you can go this far, but no further. Just like in the book of Job, when he creates the earth, and he says, see, you can only come this far. Jesus does the same thing, invoking the name of his Father. Only the Son can call on the name of the Father. That's what Jesus does. In the name of the Father, I cut them off. He's going to taste the wrath of God. He's going to go to the cross. He's not going to stay there. In the name of the Father, I cut them off. Verse 13, I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but Yahweh, the Lord, helped me. The Lord is my strength and my song. He's the perfect prayer. He's the perfect praiser. The Lord is my strength. The Lord is my song. He has become my salvation. Past tense. He's delivered. He has become my salvation. What's the first thing that comes after the salvation of the king? The king needed to be saved, not because of his own sins, for the sins of his people. And what's the first thing that happens? Verse 15, glad songs of salvation are in the tents of the righteous. Now there's a group of people called the righteous. And what are they doing? They have glad songs of salvation in their tents. They've been redeemed. First Jesus is saved, and then there's a group of people that follow him. Glad songs of salvation are in the tents of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. The right hand of the Lord exalts. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. How does the right hand of the Lord exalt? Although he was in the form of God, Jesus did not account equality with God a thing to be grasped, Philippians 2, 6, and so on. He laid it down, suffering the death on a cross like a common criminal. Therefore, what has God done? Therefore, God has highly exalted him. The right hand of the Lord exalts. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. The right hand of the Lord delivers Jesus. That's what he's saying. Verse 17, I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of Yahweh. The Lord has disciplined me severely for the sins of my followers, he's saying, but he has not given me over to death. And then he says something remarkable. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them. Who else could say such a thing? King David couldn't say that. No one could say that except for the real king, the big D, David, the Son of God, the Son of Man, the anointed king, the blessed man. Open to me, you gates of righteousness. He demands, he comes in and he says, I've done everything perfectly. Therefore, I can go through the gates of righteousness. And look what happens right after that. And he gives thanks to the Lord, and then he stands there and he says, this is the gate of the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. You could say he becomes the gate of the Lord. Jesus suffers, does everything perfectly, dies for the sins of all his followers, dies obediently to the death on a cross. He obeys his Father perfectly, is raised from the dead because he is the righteous one. The wrath of God is appeased. The Son raises from the dead, showing that that sacrifice is enough. And what does he do? He says, therefore open to me, you gates of righteousness, that I may come in. And then he says, this is the gate of the Lord. And he stands there and he opens his arms and he says, it's me. I am the gate of the Lord. That's what the I am statements are all about in the book of John. Yahweh, the bread of life. Yahweh, the resurrection. Yahweh, the way, the truth, and the life. It's me. It's me. How could God save his people? Only if God comes to his people. Jesus is God. That's what he's saying here. Open to me, you gates of righteousness, that I may go in. This is the gate of the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. So you go back to John 10. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in another way, that man, he's a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. Oh, Jesus does that. Open to me, you gates of righteousness. This is the gate of the Lord. Jesus enters by the gate. Jesus enters by the door. And what happens? Later in this passage, we'll look at it more tomorrow. It says, Jesus says, I am the door. Verse 9, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. I am the door. Jesus enters through the door and he becomes the door. Jesus enters through the gate of righteousness and he is the gate of righteousness. That's what God needed to do. God needed to send his Son, who is God incarnate, because only his Son can do this. Only his Son can be a good shepherd. All the other shepherds, they're thieves and robbers. They serve themselves. They suck the cream off the top and they let the children of Israel starve spiritually. We're going to get into that tomorrow. So he says, he who enters by the door, that's me, is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper, the Father, opens. And what do the sheep do? Well, the sheep hear his voice. Why? Because that's what sheep do. Sheep hear the voice of a shepherd. It's been well said that in Israel, if you go there, even to this date, they will water their sheep. There might be 3 or 4 different groups of sheep, 3 or 4 different shepherds, and they all water them with the same well, and the shepherd will leave, and he'll call his sheep, and they know his voice. In fact, one person, there's a story where one person even dressed up like the shepherd and called them, but they wouldn't go. Why wouldn't they follow him? Because they knew it wasn't the shepherd. They knew his voice. See, the sheep hear his voice and he calls his sheep by name and leads them out. Think of the power of that one statement. So Jesus enters the appropriate way. Jesus does everything rightfully. Jesus can go in the righteous gate. Jesus is the righteous gate. Jesus is the righteousness of God. Open to me, you righteous gates, you gates of righteousness. I'm going to come in and I'm going to stand there and I'm going to become the gate from there that day forward. Anyone who wants to come to the Father has to come through me. And guess what? The Father called them before the foundation of the world, Ephesians 1, and we know them by name. So the shepherd calls the sheep and he says, Samantha, John, Steve, whatever your name is if you're in Christ, and he calls you by name. That's a powerful visual, isn't it? It's a powerful thing to meditate on. In those seasons of maybe darkness or despair, or when you're frazzled or you're feeling spiritually weak, whatever it is, remember that. Remember that the Father has a shepherd now. It's Jesus. He did everything right, and that shepherd now calls his sheep by name. He knows every one of us by name. He doesn't have a group of 1 billion believers and he says, come on, all of you. He calls them each, one by one, individually, by name. When he has brought all his own out, he goes before them and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. How do you know a sheep's going to stay a sheep? Because they have a good shepherd. People don't leave Christianity. People don't walk away from the shepherd. That would put the shepherd's reputation at risk as a good shepherd. The shepherd doesn't lose any sheep. So when you hear people say, well, I used to be a Christian, but I went away from the Lord. You were never a Christian. Sheep don't leave the shepherd. If they do, it's not for very long. He drags them back. He's good. He's a good shepherd. He knows them by name. He knows when someone's not there. He gets them. He gets all that are his own. His sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow. False teachers can come and go, and people may follow them, but they don't really belong to the real teacher, the real shepherd, because they know his voice. But they will flee from the false teacher. They will flee from the false shepherd, for they do not know the voice of strangers. So, we'll stop there just for today. We'll get back into this tomorrow. There is one good shepherd. There is one person who's not a thief and a robber. There's one person who goes in the appropriate gate. He enters the gate of righteousness because he is the righteous one. He is God incarnate. He is Jesus Christ. There is one, and his sheep know his voice, and they follow him, and he calls them by name. And if that isn't the most beautiful gospel ever, I don't know what is. There's a good shepherd. He calls us by name. Rejoice in that. And if you don't know him, ask him. Ask him to be your shepherd too. Peace.